Hey everybody, today I wanted to talk to you about undersea cable technology. I picked this as my topic because it's something that I've always kind of been curious about, but I found that so far in my college education it's not really something that's talked about. Um, Ever since I first saw what an actual fiber optic cable looked like, I was just kind of fascinated, and the fact that there's all these hundreds of cables just ran under the ocean to connect all of us to the internet. That was, to me, it was a fascinating topic that I wanted to learn more about, and I think just about everybody, at least in this field, would be interested in. So here are my learning objectives, and this is kind of what I'm trying to teach you throughout this presentation. Instead of going super technical and risking boring everyone to death, I kind of wanted to cover this technology in its totality. I wanted to cover more than just the specifications of what is going on within the cable itself. I will cover that, but I also want to cover other things. So I'm going to start out the presentation with a general history of the cable, and this is really where I found myself fascinated because it wasn't something that I had really thought about before, but I had figured that undersea cable technology would not have been around for as long as it has, and I am fascinated where it started and how exactly they managed to accomplish what they managed to accomplish. From there, I'm going to go on and talk about what modern cables are like what's used to hold them together, what's used to power them, what's used to protect them, and as you guys will see, protection is probably most of the components of what makes up the undersea cables. I'm also going to be talking about why this cable is or why these cables are necessary. We may find it weird in a world where we have so many satellites. Why are we spending all this time and money to bury cables deep, deep, deep down in the sea? And I'll go into why that's necessary for at least for now. Um, I'm also going to talk about the massive amount of considerations that have to go in whenever you're installing new lines. There's so much that has to be considered before you even put the cable on the boat and start laying it down there. So I'll go into that. And as I just touched on, I'm going to talk about the process to install and repair lines. Uh, the 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 process to install lines, you have to have a special kind of boat, and it's just a whole thing. And repairing lines is actually one of those things where not a lot has changed over the years. It's always been kind of the same sort of process. So I'll go into that. Um, and then I'm also going to talk about what potential dangers come with undersea cables. And what I mean by that is I'm kind of talking about the fragility of just our internet as a whole and the security of our information when you look at the way that these cables are treated. So that's all pretty much encompasses all the information that I will be looking to cover within this presentation. So first, to give you guys a good background, I think it's very, very important that we talk about the history of underwater cables. So like I said, I was surprised at how far this goes back, and it actually goes back to the telegraph. So, with the telegraph, the first successful attempt at any sort of underwater transmission was in 1842 in the New York harbor. This wasn't any sort of long line, it was just kind of a dip in the water and dip back out, and it wasn't some like permanent line. It was pretty much just testing the insulation abilities so that they could maybe do a longer installation. And speaking of insulation, gutta percha is a staple of early installations with these underwater cables. It was a type of tree sap that was found by a surgeon named William Montgomery, who had found them. They were being used as whips in Southeast Asia, which is where this sap is usually found. And it was used in cables up until the 1930s. It was such a good insulation. And as you can see here on the presentation, the gutta percha is actually this brown substance here. So this is actually a old telegraph cable, undersea telegraph cable here. This black mixture is a mixture of tar and hemp. And then here you have steel cables, which are promoting the integrity. They're protecting the innards of the cable. This is also some more of this tar hemp mixture here. And then this is actually the copper wiring that was sending the telegraph signal out. So, like I said, in 1842 in New York Harbor was the first successful attempt. The first longer term and transatlantic, I guess not longer term, but longer distance cable as being a transatlantic cable was from Ireland to Newfoundland in 1858. Now, I'm reticent to call this a success because this cable only lasted a month and it used Morse code to send signals. It took 2 minutes to send a single cable. And like I said, it only lasted a month. So while it was the first transatlantic cable, it wasn't really a permanent staple and didn't last long because the insulation failed and then the cable failed. Actually, let me go back for a second. The first true cable that was able to stay long term happened 8 years later in 1866. It could transmit 8 words per minute, which was 80 times faster than that cable in 1858. So going on, in 1902, there was the first Trans-Pacific cable. There wasn't as much of a need to go Trans-Pacific. The continental U.S. pushed it because Hawaii had recently, well, within the past few years, had become a territory of theirs. And then early on in the telegraph game, like much of the 1800s geopolitical scene, Britain dominated. They had both the supply and the demand to create the cables. You had a lot of wealthy investors that wanted these cables. Because it was a big part of trade. It really helped increase communication, and so that would allow them to send ships from port to port without having to return home constantly to get the information. So it was a lot more efficient, led to a lot more profitability, and so that's why they were so heavily invested in earlier. And what I mean by Britain dominated is that out of the 30 ships that laid cable in 1896, Britain owned 24 of them. So they had quite a dominant lead out on being able to put telegraphs under the water. So then we go pretty much a whole 100 years after the telegraph is put underwater, and we're looking at telephone cables being put underwater. This idea started being thrown around in the 1920s and 1930s, but it was delayed. The implementation of it was delayed by the Great Depression. In 1964, the first Trans-Pacific line was laid from Hawaii to Japan, and really the 1960s where you see a lot of the undersea telephone technology kick off. Today, as I'm sure many of you are aware, fiber optic is what is laid under the sea. It's the backbone of the entire internet. It travels basically at the speed of light, is pretty resistant to interference, and you can pack a whole lot of data over fiber optic. So that's what we're actually putting under the sea these days. It was first used alongside telephone lines in 1988. And obviously, as I said, it's continued to be in use up until this day. So here's the current cable makeup, and there's several layers. And for the most part, most of these layers, when you boil it down, are about protecting the actual fiber optic wires here. So this outer layer is polyethylene, which is a common plastic that's used for packing. It replaced gutta percha in the 1930s because of supply factors. Gutta percha was mainly available in Southeast Asia, and so countries that didn't have access to that sap, even though it was heavily imported, they found out about this plastic, and that they started using that more commonly. That and rubber. So next you have Mylar tape, which is known for its ability to resist tension and hold things together. So that's really keeping all this stuff within, and not allowing it to space out and deconstruct from within. Here you have usually 2 layers of steel rods, which again, that's just straight up physical integrity, trying to prevent any sort of landslides or uh, anything from physically impacting the cable and then affecting the fiber. Next, you have an aluminum barrier, which is used to keep water out of the cable. Next up, you have polycarbonate, which is a thermoplastic polymer that is commonly used for extrusion with tubes. So that's allowing that to you might want to poke that like into the dirt. That's usually what that's used for. It's also structural integrity. Next up, you have the aluminum or copper tube, which that is used to conduct electricity to power the cable. Penultimately, you have the petroleum jelly covering, which is it's another, like layer 4 is a layer used to keep water out and keep the fiber together. And finally, you have the optical fiber, which in a perfect world, removed from all conditions, this is all that the information is actually traveling on. All of this stuff is just protection to make sure that the data can travel over this. And this is an example, and this would be more of a deep, or no, sorry, this would be more of a shallow sea situation with this much protection. Not all fiber cables are made the same, but this level of protection is what you would want at a shallow sea, because they're more likely to be hit by other things, so you need all these different layers of protection. When you go deep sea where there's not a whole lot down there, you don't need quite so much protection. Here I thought this was really cool. I wanted to show this website. This is submarinecablemap.com. So this gives you a live, active view of all the fiber cables that are going under the sea currently today. Over here, there's a big old list of them. I'm pretty sure there's something like 400 of these cables. And I just thought I think it's a beautiful visual. It really gives you a better idea of what I'm talking about. And so if you just want to look at this, the functionality of this is great too. So say you want to look at a specific cable here, you can click on it. And then over here, it gives you your ready for service date. So this was ready for service in September 2015. Tells you how long the cable is, tells you who owns it, and gives you a website if you want it. So you can either click on that and get one, or you can come over here, say, name a cable or need to look up a cable. You can click on it, it'll zoom in on what it is, and it will tell you that same information. So I just thought this was a really cool website, fun to look at, can give you a really good idea of where we're at and how many of these cables are, and you can look at new cables and all that sort of stuff.